Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week we're thinking about the right thing to do. How do we know what is the right thing to do? I was phoned up by a local radio a few years ago, and they were asking about a particular church dispute which was happening near me, and they said to me, Janet, why are they so people are so polarised on this, or so fixed in their ways on this, and why is there so much conflict? And I said, well, you have to remember that people are very emotionally invested in church, and that people think that they are right, and they believe that God is on their side. So that takes us to a particular position for people. The particular instance I'd like to talk about today happened in a church community that I was working with some time ago, and there was a group of people within this church community who felt very strongly that as a church we ought to be following the guidelines of giving 10% of everything that we have as our church income. So we should be giving away 10% of our income to other people, other causes, things that we felt were important, and that we should be doing that. And then there was another group of people who felt very strongly that if people had given money for the church community where we were, that they wanted that money to be spent in the church community where we were, and that if we gave that money away, then we would be in the wrong. And how did we get around this? Well, we employed a kind of Church of England fudge on the matter, really. We aimed to raise the equivalent of 10% of our income in ways that it would be clear to the people who are giving money into that situation that that money was going to something, not our local church community. So we raised quite a lot of money to support Christian Aid, we would raise money for the Children's Society and so on. Because for us, we had a group of people thinking one thing was the right way of doing it, and the other group thought the other way was the right way of doing it, and we wanted to be true to the spirit of generosity whilst also reconciling those ideas about giving just into the church community, and that's what people were expecting that money would be on. So sometimes it's not as easy as you might think to find the right thing to do. Thought for the day this week is about choosing to do the right thing, and how do we know what is the right thing to do. The gospel passage is very short this week. It's Matthew 10:40 to the end, and Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, well, if you go somewhere and they welcome you because you're my disciple, then they're welcoming me, and then they're welcoming God who sent me, and even if they just give you a cup of water, which is the basic bottom level of hospitality, then they are still welcoming me and you because of me, and that's all good, and God will remember that they have done that. And then the passage in Romans is Romans 6:12 to 23. It's longer and it's one of those nuanced passages, but basically in it Paul is saying that we do the right thing not because God wouldn't forgive us if we did the wrong thing, but we do the right thing so that we can be like Jesus. That's a précis of what he's saying, so you can go and have a look at it yourself. So it's Romans 6 verses 12 to 23. But how do we decide what is the right thing to do? So there's a kind of saying that in a situation where you say, well, what would Jesus do? But that's really interesting when we look at that, because there are lots of things that Jesus did which those people around him felt weren't the right things to do. So Jesus talked to children and he prayed for them, he blessed them, even though his disciples didn't think that that was the right thing for him to do. Jesus was always getting into trouble for healing people on the Sabbath because it was the Sabbath. Jesus also got into trouble for letting his disciples pluck grain from a field because they were hungry on a Sabbath, so they got into trouble for that. Jesus was doing all sorts of things that people didn't think was the right thing to do. Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well. She was a Samaritan, she was a woman, she wasn't a respectable woman either. So all sorts of things that everybody was surprised. They thought that Jesus wasn't doing the right thing by talking to her. And then eventually and Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, so that is quite a conflicted passage. So Mary and Martha definitely didn't think that Jesus had done the right thing by letting Lazarus die in the first place. They're very clear with him about that, and then Jesus does raise Lazarus from the dead, and that's the point, ironically enough, at which the Jewish council decide that Jesus has to die. So you read through the narration in John 11 about Lazarus dying and being raised, and then you go on immediately to the Jewish council setting where they're like, no, Jesus has to die now, this is what has to happen. So they obviously thought that Jesus wasn't doing the right thing either at that point, so they'd really got to that point in their thinking. So how do we decide what is the right thing to do? How do we discern in those nuanced situations what's the right thing to do? So sometimes there's a clear situation and there's a clear moral compass. This is the right thing to do. But when we have to make a more nuanced choice, then we need to think about, is what we're planning to do the right thing? Does it sit in this unorthodox generosity of God's love? Is it a thing that we do which is full of forgiveness? We think about Jesus turning to the criminal on the cross and saying that he would be with him in paradise forever, even though there's no time for that person to amend their life in any way. They were dying at that point. Jesus also turns around the situation around the woman with adultery and caught in adultery. So Jesus is doing those things. So how does what we do reflect the huge generosity of God's love? Because that is almost always the right thing to do. And why do we want to do the right thing? We want to do the right thing not because God will love us any more or less because we do the right thing, and not because our forgiveness depends on it, but because we are Jesus' disciples, and doing the right thing is who we are. The Dibley moment of the week this week is not necessarily a particularly rural Dibley moment, but it is a moment where I am the idiot, so I wanted to share it with you today. So this is quite a few years ago now, and I am standing in the queue to pay for petrol at a motorway service station, petrol station. I'm about 3 or 4 back in the queue, and I'm quite distracted. I'm a little bit stressed. You can tell that by the fact that I've been buying petrol at motorway services on a kind of normal sort of day. Yeah, I must have been distracted. Anyway, at the front of the queue there is a lorry driver who is not from the UK, and he is paying for his fuel with his fuel card. That's absolutely fine, and he's trying to pay for a cup of coffee with some euros, and the person at the counter is absolutely not having any of it, and I watch as it unfolds, and in the end they take the coffee away and don't let him have it because he's got no other means of paying for it. I could have paid for that cup of coffee. At the time it would have been £1.50 or £2 probably, that cup of coffee. I should have just gone to the front and paid for the coffee. I should have said that's fine. I should have done that. I have absolutely no doubt in that situation that Jesus would have done that, and that would have been the right thing to do. But I didn't do it, and I was the idiot. So that's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, will know how to do the right thing this week, and will have a really blessed week.